Alrighty, so here we go with another match. So we're on the play. We have Liliana, Fatal Push, Mishra's Bauble, 3 lands. So Mishra's Bauble fetch land is going to be pretty good cycle and card selection, since you can look at the top card of your library, then shuffle it away if it's not good. This hand is not particularly aggressive though. It's going to be very defensive, good against any other creature deck, but I think we keep it. If we're up against like Ad Nauseam or something though, we might just lose the game. So go ahead and wait on the Mishra's Bauble, see what our opponent is doing first before we make any decisions. And see Ancient Stirring's Breeding Pool, which of course indicates Bant Eldrazi. So yeah, Eldrazi Temple. So the Fatal Pushes should be fine. Liliana is probably not going to be that great. So end of turn, we're going to bauble ourselves, Sea of Verdant Catacombs, and happily shuffle that away. And draw a card. So we draw a Traverse and a Bauble, which is pretty fantastic. 2 good cards that aren't lands, basically. Even though a Tarmogoyf would have been ideal, Bauble is actually quite nice because we'll be able to do the same thing. And still not really on Delirium yet, even with Fatal Push in the graveyard, so we'll have to see if we can find like a Street Wraith or something would be perfect. And Talisman of Progress, not exactly what we want to see because we have 2 Fatal Pushes that we want to be casting, but that's okay. So we're going to do the exact same thing, bauble ourselves, see a land on top, and then shuffle it away, try and find something better. And what we find is another Bauble and a Tarmogoyf, which is actually perfect. Can finally cast a creature, and why not? Another Bauble. This one not nearly as good as the previous ones because we don't have a fetch land, but it will enable Fatal Push if we want, which is a nice little backup benefit. Oh, that does enable Fatal Push, which is perfect. So, what we should have done here is actually wait for the Thought Knot to resolve. So we look at our opponent's top card, see you have my coast, sure, whatever, and then we Fatal Push. So we should have let this resolve because we have 2 Fatal Pushes, so even if our opponent takes a Fatal Push, we would get to Fatal Push the Thought Knot anyways. And by doing it first, we actually give our opponent 1 extra card that they can look at and potentially be taking. So that was a mistake, turns out. Didn't matter a whole lot, although it gave our opponent more information and allowed them to take just the Liliana and try and keep us off Delirium. So actually kind of potentially relevant. Alright, so K Command is a great draw, Liliana is a great draw. So this turn, we still don't actually have Delirium, even though our Tarmogoyf's a 5/6, which is pretty beefy. So K Command looks pretty appealing though, can kill the Hierarch and the Talisman of Progress. Even though our opponent has a bunch of lands, it's still pretty good compared to our other options. And even first we actually enabled Delirium because otherwise we wouldn't have Delirium unless we drew something for it. So we traverse for Forest, and I mean we should be using this mana anyways a lot of the time. And we get our Reality Smashed. Of course we have the perfect answer, Liliana, for Naked Smasher. And we draw Tarmogoyf. So we can actually traverse for Death Shadow, which is pretty big, and play Tarmogoyf. So it's rare that you have a better play than just slamming Liliana and eating a Reality Smasher, but here our play is actually just quite a bit better of casting two gigantic threats, one of which is just outright bigger than the Reality Smasher. So now we're really afraid of Drowner of Hope, hoping our opponent doesn't have that. Eldrazi Displacer also somewhat annoying, but we've got a pretty huge board at this point. So, at this point, we can Liliana minus. If our opponent blinks anything, we'll be able to win immediately. So we go ahead and do that. Probably should have kept up Overgrown Tomb just in case our opponent had like some sort of main deck counterspell. So our opponent does in fact blink our Tarmogoyf in an attempt to tap it, which does work. Does tap our guy. Our Liliana sacrifice still is on the stack, and now our opponent has actually enabled Revolt for us. By blinking this Tarmogoyf, Revolt is enabled, allows us to Fatal Push the 3-drop, kill the Eldrazi Displacer, then our opponent would sack Reality Smasher, and then we would hit them for 9. So, lethal. As they say, lethal. So sideboarding against Bant Eldrazi. What do we want to bring in? So removal seems reasonable. All our graveyard interaction seems terrible. Ancient Grudge would be fine, although not particularly exciting. Like we saw Talisman, our opponent's almost certainly going to bring in Engineered Explosives, but Explosives is not a reliable target for Ancient Grudge. So Vral's bad against Eldrazi Displacer, but probably reasonable in other spots, although possibly a bit too slow, but might as well try out Vral's. Liliana is a maybe, I'd say. Fulminator Mage is also not that great on the draw. I'd rather just be casting big creatures rather than trying to attack their temples, to be honest, on the draw. Especially on the play, it seems much more reasonable, though. So Liliana is kind of good for killing Noble Hierarchs and any Eldrazi Scions and the 2/1 Eldrazi Flyer, but otherwise not that great. So, it's uncertain whether to side in or side out Liliana. Tamir Battle Rage potentially could go. Probably want the Tarfires, probably want the Hand Disruption and the Fatal Pushes for sure. Dismember for sure, Liliana, yup. Kolaghan's Command is probably like a good hedge against artifacts compared to like Ancient Grudge, I would say. So probably just one Liliana seems reasonable, and then bring these in for these. Just gonna try and kill their creatures and bash their face in. Seems like a good plan. So game 2, on the draw, and we have an interesting hand. So, I mean, we have Overgrown Tomb and what appears to be a bunch of castable cards. The issue is we really do desperately need a land with this hand. If we don't draw a land, we're going to lose. If we do, we're probably going to win. If we draw a sack land, because we'll be able to Thoughtseize and then drop multiple Death Shadows. I think it could be a keep on the draw, also a reasonable mulligan. I think playing it safe, though, is probably slightly correct here, because this hand is just going to lose a lot of the time where we just don't draw land. So I think mulliganing is completely fine there. And sure, this hand is at least much more reliable. So we see Fatal Push on top, which isn't bad because we actually do have access to a bunch of our lands and creatures. So having one piece of removal is reasonable. So we do keep it on top, and even go ahead and uh, see an immediate, very pushable target. So always bolt the bird also translates into always push the hierarch. So we're just going to do that, even though it potentially keeps us from casting Tarmogoyf next turn. Nice thing is we're going to have Delirium if pretty soon here if our opponent doesn't disrupt us. So yeah, drawing Thoughtseize is actually great as well. So our plan was to traverse into Forest and then traverse with Delirium for whatever we want, potentially a sack land, potentially Death Shadow. But now we can just traverse for Swamp. I decided to go for the original plan, which actually does seem better. Because this is going to allow us for a more powerful turn next turn. The only reason to immediately Thoughtseize would be if we're afraid of Eldrazi Temple Thought-Knot, like immediately getting us. And our opponent didn't even hit anything that amazing off this Ancient Stirrings. So we're just going to develop our land by getting a Bloodstained Mire here and then have a big turn next turn. And Sky Spawner is not exactly that threatening. So we start off with the Thoughtseize. See a pretty poor hand from our opponent. Take the Drowner, obviously, as the one card we can take. And then go for a little Tarmogoyf action. We are pretty low, though, so if our opponent were to draw something amazing here, specifically Reality Smasher, we are now suddenly in a lot of trouble because our Tarmogoyf is not quite big enough to handle that. So, now we're looking at dying to Eldrazi Sky Spawner in just 2 turns. So we really want to set up lethal. Realistically, we can only get Death Shadow because we sided out our Gorkland Rampager, though. So we're going to go ahead and do that. 10/10 Death Shadows, which is mighty frightening. So if our opponent whiffs, we're actually threatening lethal again. If our opponent attacks with this, they're just going to be dead on board because our Death Shadows will go to 10/10 or 12/12s. So our opponent needs to top deck something here, certainly. And they do an Eldrazi Displacer, which is actually one of the best draws they could have drawn. Because now we can't kill our opponent this turn, and they're going to be threatening to kill us back, and we just drew a Tarmogoyf. So suddenly we went from almost certain victory to our opponent drawing Reality Smasher, Eldrazi Displacer, and just being dead if our opponent plays Without Fear. So we attack with 1 Death Shadow. We could attack with 2. Our opponent would just chump with Sky Spawner. Next turn, blink, our 2 creatures kill us. So we could attack with none. That just means our opponent will wait a turn, blink 2 of our creatures on our turn, and then blink 2 creatures again. That does give us another draw, but it's unlikely we're going to draw out of that, since we have very few actual draws that will save us. So attacking with Death Shadow at least allows our opponent to mess up here by chumping, and it's not even really a mess up because there's a lot of things that kill our opponent here if they don't block. Of course they don't decide to block, and now we are just looking to be dead, and our opponent is fearless and just goes in for exactly not enough blockers from us. So kind of awkward that our opponent played perfectly there, but did get us in the end. And game 3, excellent hand. A bunch of ways to damage ourselves and 2 Death Shadows. Not bad. So, snap keep this. Our opponent hierarchs. So, Overgrown Tomb. And we actually just start off with Dismember because that's going to allow for a pretty sick turn 2 here. And we even draw Street Wraith. So we've dealt ourselves pretty much maximum damage with all our cards, and now we have 2 5/5s. So we're really only afraid of Engineered Explosives, and this start is even too fast for Engineered Explosives, essentially. So upkeep, our opponent has Path, which is annoying, especially since we can't return the killed Death Shadow, and we draw Liliana, which is whatever, sure. Not great, not terrible. I mean, we do have Street Wraith to return, and oops. So our opponent's hand was Rest in Peace, Ghost Quarter, Ancient Stirrings, Reality Smasher. So the way we lose this game, in my mind, is if our opponent hits us with Smasher. So I decided to take that. The Rest in Peace is almost completely irrelevant right now, although it does neuter Kolaghan's Command and Liliana in the future, but right now we're more focused on this Death Shadow. And Ancient Stirrings is going to be pretty awkward as well, because anything our opponent stirrings into is going to be difficult to cast since they don't have much colored mana. It's possible Ancient Stirrings was correct, but I mean, if our opponent hits us with Smasher, they're probably winning this game. Alright, so opponent does draw Windswept Teeth, Stirrings Intel draws a Sky Spawner, which they can't even cast. And we just have lethal now. And the Rest in Peace did not end up mattering. So we K Command, which does 2 damage to either face, winning the game. And then attack with Death Shadow. So yeah, excellent start there. The Liliana's not looking great, but turn 2 Death Shadows, 2 1-mana 5/5s is definitely good.